We're doing this again. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is another Duping the Vibes video because I told you there are so many palette releases coming out right now. Huda Beauty has been kind of teasing their newest eyeshadow palette, the Icy Nude palette, and the color story is stunning. I am in love with the icy cool tones in this palette, but as we all know, I have way too many eyeshadows. This palette is $69. To be honest, it's not really in the budget right now. So all that to say, I'm going to try to dupe the Huda Beauty Icy Nude eyeshadow palette for you today using things I already have in my own collection. I make no promises about purchasing or not purchasing this palette. It may be going on my Christmas wish list. I'm not quite sure yet. We'll see how today's video goes. But at least for right now, I find duping new palette releases really kind of cures me of that knee-jerk reaction that I have that I really feel like I need to buy the palette. So that is what we're doing today. Settle in, buckle up. I just did one of these videos for the newest Natasha Denona release, the Roxa palette. So I will have that linked in the cards for you and in the description box down below. I also have a Duping the Vibes playlist where I put all of my similar videos like this. But there are 18 shades in this palette, so we've got quite a few shades that we're looking for today. This palette does retail for $69, as I mentioned. It's got one duochrome metallic, one biodegradable glitter, 2 trio chromes, 3 foil shimmers, and 11 velvety mattes. So as per usual, I'm not going to be able to duplicate exact formulas. I love Huda Beauty because of the way that they experiment with textures and formulas in their palettes. Apparently this is the last of the large palettes from Huda Beauty, which is very sad. I love her large palettes. I have 3. Hit myself in the face. I have 3 of them, and I will be very sad that they aren't going to launch anymore. But I've also been watching as many videos and swatches and reviews as I can get my hands on, and some people have said that if you have some of the other larger palettes, there are some really similar shades that you can draw from the other Huda Beauty palettes in the line. So I'm gonna have all of my reference videos, people whose videos I watched, in the description box down below. And I'll also try to include pictures of the swatches of each shade as I'm talking about them. One person's video in particular, from Shannon Loves Makeup, was super helpful because she provided swatches of all the mattes and all the shimmers separately. Seeing the palette swatched out like that really helped me understand the contents of the palette better. Seeing the way it looks in the palette photos, it looks like a completely new color story. But when it was broken out like that, I felt like I could see a lot more clearly the ways that I might have similar tones in my collection. So I'm actually going to start with the mattes because I think I'm going to have a little bit of an easier time duping the mattes than I am the shimmers. I'm probably going to be referencing Shannon Loves Makeup's swatch photos as well so that I can show you what I mean. So definitely check out her video. She did a full review and a look using the palette. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with the matte white, which is called Avalanche. And this shade is described as a white matte. So I feel like that should be pretty easy to find in my collection. I actually don't think I have a ton of options for white mattes, but I do have one. So this shade comes from the Sample Beauty Equalizer Palette Volume 2, and the white shade in here is called Frost. And from what I was able to glean as I was quickly looking through my collection, I think this is the only matte white that I have. But how many variations on a matte white can there be? You know what I'm saying? I think we've got our dupe for Avalanche. In case you are curious as to what white matte eyeshadow looks like, here is that shade swatched. And I think that's it for that shade. We've got our dupe. Off to a strong start. Next, I'm gonna look for the matte baby pink, which is called IDGAF. And this shade is described as a, you guessed it, pink matte. So immediately I thought of my Huda Beauty Rose Quartz palette. There is a very light, cool toned baby pink matte in here, the shade called Cherished. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know if I'm gonna do better than that in my collection either. So this might be our best bet for that shade IDGAF. So here is what both of those shades are looking like, the white matte and the very light baby pink matte. I feel like that's looking pretty spot on. So let's just keep on rolling. The next deepest shade is called Oneself, and it's kind of like a pebbly light gray. It's described on Sephora as a light gray matte. I know I have light gray mattes in my collection. I think it's just going to be about the undertone for this one. I'm wondering about the shade Radiate in the Rose Quartz palette. I never really thought of this shade as a gray, but I guess it is. It just has a little bit of like a periwinkle undertone to it, which I feel like might be pretty close to this shade. Yeah, I think that shade is definitely too pink and not cool toned enough. I also grabbed out my Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette and my Glam palette. I'm gonna try the shade Stone from the I Need a Nude and see if that's still a little bit too brown. It's definitely closer, but it's not quite gray enough. It's still a little bit too neutrally brown. Actually, let me take a look at, this is a Sydney Grace single called Speedway. It looks like it might be the perfect tone, actually. It's like that nice cool gray, but it's got a little bit of that pebble tone to it. Let's give that a swatch. I think that shade Speedway from Sydney Grace is actually really, really close to the one in the Huda Beauty palette. And I think it's as close as I'm going to get right now. So I'm gonna go with Sydney Grace Speedway for the shade Oneself. Next up we have the shade Poised, which is just like a couple steps deeper than the shade Oneself. It is described as a pink gray matte, but in the swatches it doesn't look all that pink. I'm thinking about this shade from the ColourPop Mandalorian palette called Mythosaur. It's like a taupey gray matte. It needs to be like a really mid-toned shade though. It can't be too deep and it can't be too light. Wow, that might actually be kind of spot on. I feel like that is a really, really good dupe for that shade actually, because it's got a tiny touch of like taupey warmth in the undertone, but overall it comes across as gray. Having really good luck starting with the mattes, maybe that is the way to go when doing these videos. Or maybe this is just a palette that has a lot of different kind of neutral mattes in it that we all probably have in our collections. Then we have Cold Plunge. This is described as a neutral nude matte. Looking at the swatches from Shannon Loves Makeup, it looks basically the same as her skin tone, so I feel like there's a lot of different shades that could potentially work for this. I'm thinking maybe of the shade Transition from the Natasha Denona Glam palette. That might even be too deep for what this shade is. It might be a little bit too kind of gray and undertone for what this shade looks like, but I feel like that could definitely work if you have the Glam palette. I'm going to keep looking for a little bit lighter of an option. I'm swatching Flower Child from my Tartelette in Bloom palette, and I think that is going to be perfect because it's blending in pretty much exactly with my skin. So I don't even know if you can see that. You can probably see the hint of gray from the Natasha Denona Glam palette up here, and then I just swatched Flower Child right below it, but I think that is pretty much the perfect shade for this. Next up we have First Class, which looks like a lot warmer of a brown. It's described as a peachy matte, and again I feel like we all have that kind of a shade multiple times over in our collections. It's just about getting the right amount of depth because it is still a very light toned shade. I feel like the shade Juicy from the Naughty Nudes palette could be really close. It's just this one on the corner here. I'm gonna give that a swatch. Might be a little bit too dark, but it's definitely the right amount of peachiness. I need to kind of pay attention here because there's two shades that are really close together. So we have First Class, which is the one that we've been working on. But then there's also this shade called Lavish, which is described as a dusty pink matte. In the photo swatches on Huda's website, they look like really different shades. Looks like Lavish is a lot deeper than First Class, but then when I'm looking at the swatches in Shannon Loves Makeup's video, they look like they're really actually similar in their depth and just different in their undertone. So I'm kind of looking for both of those shades at the same time. I'm thinking for First Class, I'm gonna take the more kind of orangey toned matte from the Natasha Denona Mini Nude palette, because when I swatch it on my hand, it looks really, really close to the way that that shade looks in Shannon's swatches. And for Lavish, I'm gonna try another shade from the Mandalorian palette. This is the shade Bantha Tracks, and it looks like it might be a similar depth, but have more of that pinkiness that we're looking for. And I think that's pretty good for that shade Lavish. Maybe a touch light, but built up on the eye. I think it's gonna look like exactly the right color. Next, we have another more cool toned one. This is the shade High Life, and it's described as a soft purple matte. I wouldn't describe it that way from the photos on Huda's website. It definitely has like a lavender pink to it, but definitely still cool toned. And definitely in the swatches on Shannon's arm, it looks very gray in tone. Maybe that's where that shade Radiate from the Rose Quartz palette would work, because it had more of that pink to it, but it was still quite gray leaning. I'll swatch that one again here. And swatched out, it does kind of look purpley. That one's still looking a little bit light, so I am just gonna try the shade Precious from the Rose Quartz palette and swatch them next to each other. So this shade is Radiate and this shade is Precious. I think I'm gonna go with Precious because it has a little bit more of that gray depth to it, but it's still leaning in the purple direction. So I think that's gonna work well for this shade. Moving right along here, I'm trying to be more efficient in this video than I was in the last one. I have the shade Unapologetic, which looks like a beautiful chestnut brown. They describe it as a burgundy matte. So I think we have two really good options for the shade, both from Huda palettes. So first I'm gonna try the shade Aura from the Rose Quartz palette. Hard to show you these palettes because of the mirror and the lights, but it's this one here, that kind of chestnutty brown with a little bit of red to it. I think Huda might have duped herself on that one again, because that is, it just looks very, very similar to the way the shade in the Icy Nude palette is looking. I think I'm gonna take that one to the bank. And then we have She Rich, which is described as a deep brown matte. And it definitely looks deeper than any of the other shades that are in the Huda palettes that I have. Almost like a charcoaly brown, definitely leaning a little bit cool tone. So I'm just looking through all my palettes here. Thinking maybe of my Tartelette in Bloom palette again, and this shade Activist. It's very deep. It's still a brown, but it's a cool tone brown that's like leaning hard into the kind of charcoaly tones. I think that's actually gonna be perfect. Why am I having such better luck with this video? Oh no, I think I messed up. The shade that I just swatched is actually called Faux Fur. Whoops. Faux Fur is that really deep brown one. We haven't gotten to She Rich yet. So Faux Fur is described as a chocolate brown matte, and She Rich is a deep brown matte. Okay. Of course, after I brag about how well this video is going is when I mess something up. Why am I having such better luck with this video? I'm still gonna keep She Rich as the Tarte Activist shade. And for Faux Fur, I'm gonna swatch another Sydney Grace. This is in the shade All Mine Deep, and it looks similar to the Tarte shade, but maybe a touch lighter. And that is exactly what we need. So let's try this. Yeah, I think those two are gonna be pretty much perfect. So All Mine Deep from Sydney Grace is gonna be my dupe for Faux Fur. And then She Rich is still going to be the Tarte Tartelette in Bloom palette in the shade, what was it called again? And the shade Activist. Sorry for the confusion. I definitely confused myself on that one as well. But the good news is that that is all of our mattes done. So all things considered, that was not very difficult to find pretty close dupes for those shades. I think the shimmers is definitely where it's going to get a little bit more tricky, but just in case that helps you with your lusting after this palette at all, I was able to find almost exact, like almost identical dupes for the majority of the palette because the majority of the palette is mattes. I'm a little nervous to get into the shimmers. There is a duochrome in here. It's called Iced Out. It's described as a white duochrome metallic, and the duochrome to me seems like it flips to like a purpley blue. So I'm wondering how different that's going to be to the duochrome shade in the Rose Quartz palette. The one I'm thinking of is Moon Magic here. I just feel like it's not going to be that different from this shade. I feel like the shade Moon Magic might even be a little bit more special than the shade Iced Out because it just flips so beautifully from purple to blue to pink. On the camera, you can definitely see the strong shift from white to blue though, so I'm feeling like this might be a pretty darn close dupe to the shade Iced Out. And looking at the swatches on Shannon's arm again, I just don't know that I'm going to get any closer than that. So I think my dupe for Iced Out is going to be Moon Magic from the Rose Quartz palette. This is the shade that always leaves a ton of sparkles on my hand, making me shine in the sun like Edward Cullen. Okay, so it looks like apart from the glitter topper shade, there are two very clear silver shades in the palette. The lighter one is called Platinum and the darker one is called Diamond Dew. So I'm going to swatch those out together because I feel like they're going to have some similar qualities. I'm almost wondering if I can get both of these shades also from the ColourPop Mandalorian palette because this one has a really bright silver shimmer and a slightly deeper silver shimmer. So for the shade Platinum, I'm swatching Beskar Steel, which to be honest is not swatching the best. And then for Diamond Dew, I'm swatching Imperial Credit. These two shades are definitely more of like a satin metallic than the ones from Huda seem to be. I don't really have that many silvers to choose from. I'm gonna try to swatch a few more things though, just to see if we can find something a little bit more shiny and impactful. But I do think that tone-wise, these would work really well. For Platinum, I'm going to try this shade from the BH Cosmetics Blueberry Muffin palette called Hot and Fresh. Another hard palette to show on camera, but I think this is going to be a little bit more, oh yeah, just bright and impactful, which definitely seems like what the shade in the Huda palette is going for. I've also got a shade from my Beauty Bay and Jade Thirlwall palette called Confetti, which can look a little bit blue, but I think it is technically a silver. Ooh, and this one I think might be it, because it just has way more shine and sparkle than any of the ones that I've swatched so far. So this one on top is from the Blueberry Muffin palette, and this one is from the Jade Thirlwall palette. I am definitely going with this one for Platinum. That is beautiful. There is just no recovering from the amount of sparkles that is on the back of my hand right now. So if you see sparkles in the swatches, I'm sorry. For Diamond Dew, I'm going to swatch something from my Pat McGrath Moonlit Seduction palette. I'm not sure what the shade name is, but it's the silver in the palette. It might be too taupey, darn it. Oh, such a pretty shade though. It's definitely too brown and taupey for what we're looking for. I feel like everything in the Glam palette is too brown, and there's not enough of like a strong silver in the Glam palette. I think there's some silvers in the Odin's Eye Christmas Eve palette. Ooh, okay. So this shade called Snowflake looks really promising. So pretty. Okay. Wow. Okay. Wow. Let me swatch that next to Confetti from the Beauty Bay Jade palette. Okay, so I think the shade Snowflake from the Odin's Eye palette is a step down from the shade from the Beauty Bay palette that we had for Platinum. So I'm going to use Odin's Eye Snowflake for the shade Diamond Dew, and I just cannot believe how pretty that shade is. It's absolutely stunning. And then there is a pressed glitter shade in the palette. I don't have any pressed glitters, or the ones that I do have are definitely not silver. I think the closest thing that I'm gonna have comes from the ABH Norvina, I always forget which one this is, the Pro Pigment Palette Volume 4. Shade just fell out. This palette, I swear, it's supposed to be my current Project Level Up palette, but shades keep falling out of it, so I don't really know how that project's gonna go. But the shade that I'm gonna use as my dupe for bling is this shade A1. It's hard to show you without things in this palette falling out, but it's the shade A1, which is, it's kind of like a drier, almost chunkier sort of silvery glitter topper shade. I'm honestly not too concerned about finding a perfect dupe for this shade because I don't really want to put pressed glitters on my eyes. But just for the sake of the video, I think I'm just going to have this be my dupe for the shade Bling, even though it's not as chunky of a sparkle. I've heard several people describe that shade as like quite rough and textured, which honestly is not a great selling point for the palette, but I think for the sake of the dupes, that's just what I'm gonna do. That leaves us with just 3 more fairly neutral shimmery shades: Gold Standard, Aurora, and VVS. Gold Standards is described as a bronze metallic, Aurora is described as a deep pink metallic, and VVS is described as a sparkly pink metallic triochrome. I'm going to look into my Moonlight Seduction palette again from Pat McGrath, and I'm going to swatch this more bronzy shade here and then 2 of these like quote-unquote special shades, although the special shades in this palette are different. There's a more pink one and a more gold one, and see if any of those comes close. I think I can probably find closer dupes for Aurora, which is the bronze, and Gold Standards, which is the gold. But I think for VVS, which is supposed to be like a shifty-ish kind of a pink shade, I think this pink one from the Moonlight Seduction palette is actually kind of perfect. It's described as a triochrome. I can't really speak to that because I don't see that in any of the swatches, but I feel like in terms of like the base tone being sort of like a warm neutral pink, and then the actual like shimmer and sparkle, I feel like that tone's a pretty good match. Aurora looks almost purpley in the swatches on Shannon's arm. So I'm gonna try this shade from the Naughty Nudes palette called Please Me. It's definitely a bronze, but it has like a pink shimmer to it. So I'm wondering if it might show up a little bit pinky. Oh wow, it's almost like a duochrome. So it flips like from bronze to like a rose gold. That's pretty close. I'm gonna try the shades Raw, which is this one, and Nearly Natural, which is this one from the Glaminatrix Nearly Natural palette. Just look how creamy those bottom 2 shimmers look. Stunning. I think either of them would work as dupes for the shade Aurora, but because it just looks that little bit purple, I'm gonna go with Raw, just because it's got a little bit more of that like rosy undertone to it. Such a pretty shade. Love this palette. Again, I thought that the shades in the Natasha Denona Glam palette would really work for these shades, but none of them are quite purpley enough, if that makes sense. And then that leaves us with one more shade, Gold Standard, which looks like a pretty yellowy gold. They describe it as a bronze metallic, but to me it definitely looks light gold. I'm gonna try Tantric from the Naughty Nudes palette because it looks like that same kind of a light gold shade. My hand is so sparkly, I'm just gonna do it on the inside of my hand this time. Can you see that? I feel like that's pretty darn close. Let me see if I have any other gold options. Looking also at the swatches on Shannon's arm, and it looks a little bit like a tinge lighter. Let's try the shade Flower Power from the Naughty Nudes. Flower Power is one of these swirled shades in the Naughty Nudes palette, and hopefully you can see it up against Tantric. It just looks a little bit more yellow. And up against the swatches, that shade Flower Power looks exactly the same. So I'm gonna go with Flower Power for gold standard, which means that we have successfully found matching shades for every single color in this palette from my collection. Yay! Apart from the pressed glitter. I kind of cheated on that one. I am going to swatch this out on my arm and put it up against the photograph swatches from Huda's website so that you can see my swatches of my own dupe palette, and then I will come back and put together a look inspired by the Icy Nude palette. Okay, it's the next day and we're ready to do our eye look. I tried to match the theme by wearing something that was like Snow Bunny Ice Queen vibes. Didn't have a lot of options to choose from for that, but I did try. I tried to put on my iciest lip gloss, which is from the Michaela and Glamlight collection. Got a cool toned Cold Girl bright pink blush on from Patrick Ta. This one here, in case you're curious, they don't sell this trio anymore, but they do sell a single of this. It's called She's a Doll. I've got a picture of the palette pulled up and I'm going to just dip into it as if I had the palette in front of me, but using the dupes that we found in my collection. Okay, I zoomed you in slightly so you can see. So I'm gonna start with the shade Oneself, which for me was the Sydney Grace single in the shade Speedway. And I'm gonna put that in my crease. Actually, let me curl my eyelashes real quick. I am one of those weird people who likes to curl my eyelashes before I start my eye look because otherwise I feel like I just mess up the eyeshadow. This is just a MAC eyelash curler, by the way. I've had it for years. I did prime my lids as usual with the Ulta Beauty matte eye primer, and I set my lids with my Charlotte Tilbury Airbrush Flawless Finish Powder. I really love the Sydney Grace matte shadows. I actually have a video where I tried Sydney Grace for the first time. I'll try and link that if I remember in case you are interested in Sydney Grace. I had a very sweet friend actually send me a palette of singles for my birthday last year, which was so sweet. And I had a lot of fun trying out these shades in that video. For just a touch more warmth, I think I'm gonna go in with the shade Lavish, which for me is the ColourPop Mandalorian palette and this shade right here called Bantha Tracks. And I'm just gonna put a little bit of that through the crease as well. Just kind of mixing those two shades together. I find with cool tones sometimes I need a little bit of warmth in the crease. I'm now going to dip into my dupe for Unapologetic. I just want to put that in the outer corner to start building up a bit of depth and a little bit more purpleness, and then I'm gonna blend it out with one of the cooler tone shadows to keep this look a little bit more icy, if you will. The Huda Beauty matte formulas are so nice. Then just on the same brush, I'm gonna take my dupe for the shade Poised, which is the Mandalorian palette again, and this time it's the shade right here called Mythosaur. And I'm just gonna kind of blend around those edges. And then taking the brush we started with a little bit of Speedway again and going around the edges. Since the Mandalorian palette is open in front of me, I'll dip into a little bit of Bantha Tracks as well. And use that to help blend into the crease. Not to toot my own horn or anything, but I think that is a gorgeous crease combo, and definitely not a combo I would think to put together on my own, but like a cooler toned plum I'm loving this. I might go in and add a little bit more depth just at the lash line after we do our shimmers, but I think I want to dip into some shimmers next. In the outer corner, I am definitely going to be taking my dupe for the shade Aurora, which comes from the Glaminatrix Nearly Natural palette and is the shade Raw. Even if we just put a little hint of this on the eye, I have to put it on my eyes because I think it is just the most beautiful shade ever. Should I do a glitter primer? I don't think this shade needs a glitter primer, but I'm gonna put one down just to try and avoid fallout. I just used the NYX glitter primer, by the way. And then taking that shade Raw from the Nearly Natural palette, I'm just gonna kind of press that where the mattes start. Oh my gosh, that shade. It is so pretty, and it's going to be the perfect gradient into the silvers because it has such a strong silver sparkle to it. I know this video is not about encouraging you to buy palettes, but I will just say Glaminatrix decided to restock the Nearly Natural palette. It's expensive. Shipping to the US takes a while, but it is a very, very special palette. If you had been wanting it and waiting for it to come back, could put that shade all over the lid, but I want to incorporate a little bit more silver. So I'm gonna take my dupe for Diamond Dew, which comes from the Odin's Eye Christmas Eve palette, and it's the shade Snowflake, which is this incredible silver shade. Just grabbing a little of that and kind of pressing it into my hand so that the flakier sparkles hopefully don't fall down. And I'm just going to, I barely touched my eye and it is so impactful. I'm just going to kind of push that right up against that other shade that we used. I'm gonna reserve a tiny little space on the inner corner to see if we can fit one more shade. And I'm also just going to barely blend those two shades together. How beautiful. The beauty of Odin's Eye shimmers. Odin's Eye shimmers, Glaminatrix shimmers. I'm in heaven. I did get a tiny bit of glitter fallout, but it's worth it, honestly, for how sickeningly beautiful that shimmer is on the eyes. I'll just have extra sparkly cheeks, but I think it just adds to the overall icy vibe. I feel like I want to use my dupe for Iced Out, which is that duochrome shade, but I might put that on the lower lash line. And maybe for the inner corner, I take my dupe for Platinum, which comes from the Beauty Bay and Jade Thorough Wall palette, and it's the shade Confetti right here. I'll just put a tiny little bit of that right on this inner corner space and just kind of rainbow it up and over a little bit. Are we seeing this? This might be one of my favorite looks I've ever done. And that alone is a good reason to make these Duping the Vibes videos because it just forces me out of my comfort zone. I pair palettes I would never otherwise pair, and I always love the looks. And I think that's the eyelid done. I'm gonna try to use some shades I haven't used yet on the lower lash line. I haven't used Faux Fur yet, so I'll put that on the outer corner on the bottom, and my dupe for that is the Sydney Grace Single in the shade All Mine, the deep version. Stamping that about halfway over on the lower lash line. And then to blend that out, I'm going to take High Life, which for me is the shade Precious from the Huda Beauty Rose Quartz palette. Just kind of lightly go around the edges of that to blend it out and also connect it to the outer corner on the top. Okay, and then maybe on the bottom, we do a little bit of VVS, which for me comes from the Pat McGrath Moonlight Seduction palette, and it's the light pink special shade in this palette. I'm trying to fit as many shades as I can on my eyes, but there are 18 shades in this palette, so it's just the best I can do. I'm just gonna do a little like tiny sprinkle of that right in the middle on the lower lash line. And then on the very inner part of my lower lash line, I'm going to take the shade Moon Magic from the Rose Quartz palette. I had to do it. This is my dupe for the shade Iced Out from the Icy Nude. And just in that little space right in front of my tear duct. It looks like I'm crying in tears of ice. Kind of love that. Just for funsies, I'm going to take my dupe for the shade She Rich, which is from the Tartelette in Bloom palette, and it's the shade Activist. And I'm just going to line with this color just at the outer portion of my lash line here. Not a necessary part of the look, but definitely an option for how to use this shade in the palette. And then I'm also going to take a little bit of that just at the base of the lashes on the bottom, but just to barely connect it up at the top. We've got a nice little smoky liner moment. Okay, and then finally, I really do promise this is going to be the final step. I'm going to take my dupe for the shade Avalanche, which comes from my Sample Beauty Equalizer Volume 2 palette, and it's the shade Frost. Very appropriate name. And I'm going to just pop a little bit of that right on the inner corner. Some might call it extra. Some might say I did too much. I love it. This is such a fun look. I feel like this color story would lend itself really well to simple looks, pairing any one of the shimmers with a couple of the mattes, but I don't know. I feel like I got a really unique look that I never would have put together on my own without doing this process. So I'm really happy with that. I'm gonna go do some mascara. I'm gonna fix my hair up, reapply some of my Frosty lip gloss, and then I will be back to finish out this video. Okay, we're back with the finished look. I did a bunch of mascara and I used the Wet n Wild So Defined Volumizing and Defining Mascara, which is only $5 and it has quickly become my favorite mascara. So yeah, I really tried to build up the lash to give this look some drama, and I'm really happy with how this turned out. Let me know in the comments down below if you are planning on purchasing the Huda Beauty Icy Nude palette. Maybe it's going on your holiday wish list, or if you're just going to try to dupe it using what you have in your collection. As I've said, I think a few times in this video, I think the mattes might be already in your collection. It's just down to the specific kind of undertones in the palette, purpley grays and the kind of pinky browns. If you have a few eyeshadow palettes that have silvers and bronzes, you probably have similar shimmers. So if this palette is not in the cards for you right now, I definitely think you can create a similar vibe using what you have. However, if you are planning on purchasing the palette, I did just want to mention, because one of the videos I was watching reminded me, it might have been Shannon Loves Makeup. Huda Beauty typically runs a pretty good Black Friday sale, so it might be worth holding out for that. And on the Huda Beauty website, they do run a lot of sales kind of all year round. So just something to keep in mind if you are trying to budget for this palette. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I had a lot of fun making it. Let me know if there are any other palettes that you would like to see me dupe using things I already have in my collection. Give the video a like if you liked it. Maybe subscribe if you haven't already. If you like this type of content that's just encouraging us to use all the makeup that we have. Thank you so much for watching today, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!